everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Adam Mestian, and I'm an assistant professor of history at the Duke History Department. And this is a celebration, a book launch of Professor Ziad Fahmy's most recent book at the Duke Middle East Studies Center, the DUMESC. And we would like to thank, I would like to also, immediately, I would like to thank Professor Ellen McClarney, the director of the center, for supporting and hosting this talk, for Professor Fahmy, and also, of course, Griffin Orlando, our fantastic vice director and coordinator of DUMESC. So what will happen today is I will introduce Professor Fahmy. Then he will give a book talk, and after that we will have an occasion for chat and free discussion. Now this is a so-called webinar format of Zoom meeting, which means that the attendees, you attendees, can pose questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and in theory I will read your questions aloud to Professor Fahmy. But if you really want to talk, you can also raise your hand. I think you have the raise hand function, and I can unmute you. But in practice, this is usually an easier and more, I don't know, more convenient way if you just pose your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. You can also, during the talk, you can already write, so I can see the question, and afterwards we can organize ourselves in a better way. All right, so let me introduce Professor Fahmy. First of all, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure.
Professor Fahmy is a professor of modern Middle East history at the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Cornell University. As I presume everybody in the audience well knows his name and his work. I myself, I am among his fans in his fan club. He is the author of Ordinary Egyptians, Creating the Modern Nation Through Popular Culture, which was published in 2011, exactly 10 years ago, by Stanford University Press, which was an immensely successful and influential book in modern Egyptian history and in general in cultural history, focusing on especially the colloquial Arabic in Egypt. This is the book talk that he will give us today about his second book, Street Sounds, Listening to Everyday Life in Modern Egypt, which was just published by Stanford University Press in August 2020. And I already know that Professor Fahmy is actually preparing for his third book, and hopefully we can have a little chat after the talk about that project as well, because it is connected to this second one as far as I know. But the floor is yours, Professor Fahmy. Thank you so much for joining us. And after the talk, I'm just telling the audience, we will have a space for Q&A, so please prepare yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Just bear with me as I share my screen, at least for the talk itself. All right, and there we go. Minimize everything else. Thank you all for attending. And of course, I'd like to thank Professor Adam Mestian for inviting me to present this paper, and Griffin Orlando for organizing and dealing with the Zoom and everything else. And again, thank you all for attending. I know, of course, all too well about Zoom fatigue in this age of COVID-19. So thank you for joining me for this lecture. The specific title for this presentation, which is sort of part of my book, is Working in the Streets, Silencing Cairo's Street Hawkers. And it'll essentially deal in part with chapter 2 of my book. And you can see in the outline on the right-hand side. And the reason I posted this as well is I want you to get a sense of where this particular talk fits in with a larger product. So before I delve into the paper, I'll briefly give you an overview of the book so you can get a sense of where everything fits. In the book itself, I examine everyday life in Egypt using sound and the politics of sound as one of the key tools for uncovering the changes that went on in Egyptian streets during the first half of the 20th century. I argue that by listening in to these street changes, we can get a lot closer to the embodied realities of everyday life. This, I argue, allows for a more micro-historical examination of everyday people's interactions with each other and helps us evaluate the impact of the various street-level technological and infrastructural changes taking place at the turn of the 20th century and beyond. So that's the title of this specific talk. Historians have recently started listening to the past, contributing to what David Hose describes as, and I quote, a sensorial revolution in the humanities and social sciences. In the same way that all 5 senses are relevant to our daily understanding of the world around us, they should be vital to our understanding of historical events. Examining the changes or examining the changing soundscapes of the past and interpreting how people sonically experience their world makes possible a richer, more comprehensive, micro-level grasp of everyday life. As this presentation will reveal, by listening into the sources, historians can get a little closer to the mundane realities taking place in the streets, revealing a great deal about how ordinary people dealt with modernity and encroaching state authority. This embodied micro-historical approach can also uncover everyday men and women's daily struggles to make a living through their use and misuse of the public streets. As I hope to demonstrate, there is much to be discovered by incorporating sounds and soundscapes into our methodological toolkit. But before we continue our discussion, we must address some common misconceptions about the nature of sound and its suitability for historical study. For contemporary events, or for many historical events that occurred in the second half of the 20th century, sound and audiovisual recordings are available for examination. But how can researchers fill in the sensory gap when writing about historical periods before the invention of recording technology? The obvious solution to this problem may be found in the same text that historians have been using all along, or as R. Murray Schafer has eloquently stated, historians will have to turn to ear witness accounts. The fact that historians silently read texts in the archives does not mean that the original writers were only depicting visual observations. People acquire content, meaning, and information from their physical environment using all 5 senses, of course. Lest we forget, the very act of writing is as much tactile as it is visual. And the information being conveyed will no doubt be full of embodied multisensory content. So by attuning ourselves to the sounds described within the text, we can perceive the perspective that the original author has conveyed regarding the sounds, noises, and words that they may have heard. Also, writers, of course, don't just record what they have seen and heard, depending on the events they are covering and the context of the document that they are writing. They can also detail olfactory, tactile, and gustatory information. Each historical time and locale has their varied natural, animal, human, and technological sounds that play an important role in defining the place to its inhabitants. These sounds have an assortment of economic, environmental, social, and cultural implications, which are vital to a well-rounding understanding of the past. As many of you know, of course, in Egypt, coffee shops were and continue to be an extension of the street in that their spatial and sonic boundaries usually expanded beyond their officially enclosed space. Weather permitting, most cafes sat more people outside on the sidewalks than inside, with obvious sonic implications for the neighborhood that surrounded them. And of course, you can see this from this image that I supplied here. This meant that passersby, be they paperboys, street vendors, entertainers, or simply pedestrians, could observe and listen to, if not participate, in the coffee shop experience. As newer, louder technologies such as gramophones and radio sets were introduced, the acoustic imprints of cafes must have dramatically increased as well. Commercial activity was and still is loudly conducted in the sidewalks of these cafes, as dozens of street hawkers took advantage of the already seated and hence captive clientele. And this image certainly depicts that. Street hawkers didn't, of course, sell their goods near the market or to coffee shop customers. As new institutions like theaters, cinemas, and even train and tram stations were introduced, street hawkers followed with their wares and loud calls. Tramways themselves often served as ready-made moving platforms for street hawkers to make a sale. Electric tramways were not just vehicles for transporting people, they also created their own embodied social and economic space, allowing for direct and indirect sociability and economic interaction across gender, culture, and class lines. Tramways were not, as you can clearly see from some of these images, tramways were not hermetically sealed capsules, and sensory perception and engagement with the streets was ongoing for all tramway passengers, especially for those sitting or standing near the open doors and windows. In fact, most Cairene trams, save for a little metal side rail, were entirely open to the street. Not only were the cheapest tramway tickets affordable, but by avoiding the conductor altogether, many could easily use the tram without paying a penny. This was frequently done by children, students, and street merchants who could easily climb in and out or simply hang onto the outside of the tram. In fact, the line between pedestrian and tram rider was not always clear, as it was easy for paying and even non-paying individuals to go in and out of the tram when it stopped in traffic or when the tram was moving at slow speeds, which is often the case in Cairo and Alexandria as well. Multilingual, let me show you the next slide. It's a perfect example of some of this, what I call, I guess, tram surfing. Multilingual signs in Arabic, English, French, and Greek were posted on the trams, forbidding passengers from riding on the footboard running outside the tram. These signs were, as you can see from these pictures, were rarely obeyed in practice, as footboards were always in use by paying customers when the tram was overcrowded, and by also what I call tram surfers, who latched onto the outside to avoid the fare. Newspaper boys, shoe blacks, trinket sellers also relied on the footboard for jumping on and off the moving tram at will. This sort of tram surfing was very common in Egypt, as this 1918 account confirms, and I'm quoting here. If the regulations about riding on footboards were enforced, the hawkers of meats, drinks, and knickknacks would not plague you with their constant solicitations. The boot boys carry on their trade furtively between the seats. Often, they ride for a mile, working hard on a half a dozen boots. The police, of course, attempted to limit tram surfing. And in 1921, just in the Abdeen district of Cairo alone, there were 731 citations given for illegal tram riding. However, by all accounts, this was just a drop in the bucket and did little to discourage the practice. For example, a little bit much later, I suppose, an American couple living in Egypt in 1955 remarked, and I quote, "We were able to spend many enjoyable hours exploring the city. These journeys were usually made by tram, a most exciting experience, as the majority of Cairo trams are open at either side and travel so slowly that peddlers can come and go at will, even when the tram is in motion." So public transportation, and trams in particular, provided a moving platform for writers to talk, buy, sell, and engage in a variety of social and economic interactions. As a physically moving space that outsiders can enter and exit with ease, tramways are neither private nor entirely public. In many ways, tram surfing illustrates the relative liminality of the tram as a new modern space, which on a daily basis allowed for embodied and loud interactions. Moreover, the use and misuse of the trams by paying and non-paying passengers, street hawkers, and even pickpockets indicates that trams were, for the most part, almost entirely appropriated by the urban residents for their own use, going well beyond their intended use as basic transportation. Street hawkers had regular routes in most urban residential neighborhoods. The loudness and pitch of their calls were essential to reaching inside the homes of their customers. It was more than just the actual words being sounded. It was the unique inflection, tone, and pitch of a particular seller's voice that signaled from a distance the exact product being sold. The astute listener could then approximate the distance and time of the hawker's arrival, giving them time to walk down the stairs and conduct the transaction. Of course, you can see this clearly from at least the image on the left. For most smaller items, the customers didn't even need to descend to the street. Most households had handy wicker baskets attached to long ropes, which they could send down cash and bring up to purchase goods. In these scenarios, both the buyers, who were predominantly women, and the sellers shouted the details of the transactions for all to hear. You can see the wicker basket on the right. This is a knife sharpener in Cairo in the 1920s. In this particular case, I guess they would lower their knife along with the cash. And you can imagine first the sound of the knife sharpening as it was going on, but also the transaction back and forth as the customer and the merchant are yelling back at each other. Building walls may visually create a partition separating private from public. But at the time, especially in the early parts of the 20th century, most walls could hardly stop sound from traveling through. Windows, balconies, and doors enhanced the sonic penetration and served as sensory portals connecting residents with their neighbors and their neighborhood. There was little sound insulation in walls in late 19th to mid 20th century houses. And residents in poorer districts did not have glass windows to even slightly buffer against street sound. Road noises and even loud conversations were easily heard inside houses and apartments. In most cases, that was not necessarily undesirable, as connecting with your neighbors and interacting with street hawkers was not only convenient, but also the expected norm. Windows, balconies, and rooftops, well, these images will be for a later section, so I moved a little bit ahead on the slides. But windows, balconies, and rooftops had the potential to become liminal zones that were neither private nor public, especially when they were actively used as platforms for social and economic engagements. The mere presence of hawkers in the streets in significant numbers created regular spheres of physical interaction and conversations with pedestrians, other vendors, store owners, and even residents who had their windows or doors open. The more one listens to these interactions, the more it becomes apparent that the public versus private split was never as rigid as theorized. For instance, Mary Whately, a longtime resident of late 19th century Cairo, wrote that she often heard through her window her neighbors talking to each other and to street merchants. Whately's neighbor, for example, who regularly sat on her reed mat selling sugar canes in the street corners next to her window, and I'm quoting, talked incessantly to anyone who came within earshot, whether customer or not. Whately also vividly described how in the late afternoons when the street merchants were closing up their accounts, she would regularly hear, and I quote, a few sharp bargainers trying to get oranges, beans, etc. at a lower rate than before. The clatter of tongues was quite astonishing. Whately could clearly hear these conversations from her window. Windows, doors, rooftops, and balconies more directly focus the auditory and sometimes visual interactions between those who are partly on the inside and yet still engaged in varying degrees with their neighbors or street hawkers on the outside, providing liminal spaces of direct sensory interaction that were neither entirely public nor private. In Egypt, a significant number of the street hawkers were women. In fact, many late 19th and early 20th century observers have noted a somewhat gendered division of labor among the male and female street hawkers. Back to Mary Whately again, who in the 1860s and 70s lived in the Cairene district of Bab el-Bahr, remarked that Egyptian women typically sold milk, clotted cream, yogurt, oranges, radishes, grilled corn, sugarcane, and other fresh produce. In 1902, Muhammad Omar corroborates and expands on Whately's assessment by stating that men specialize in selling matches, books, shoes, sweets, clothing articles, pistachios, botarga, textile, cheese, breadsticks, newspapers, peanuts, oil, whistles, bracelets, pottery, and everything for a penny. Or for those of you that know Arabic, كل حاجة بقرش سعر. Women, according to Omar, sold flowers, textiles, rose water, dates, milk, honey, ghee, oranges, dates, and corn. But this observed division of labor between male and female street merchants was not hard and fast, as I found plenty of evidence of women selling jewelry and cheese, for example. In any case, there's no evidence of any official or social mechanism that specifically forbade female vendors from selling a particular product. The above left image is actually of a peasant woman selling farmer's cheese. So up to the first half of the 20th century, the number and variety of calls and cries from street merchants dwarfed what they are today. A contemporary observer in mid-1930s Cairo documented 165 distinct calls and cries by street hawkers. And that was just for produce and food sellers. The merchants loudly and melodically emphasized the freshness, ripeness, taste, size, or geographic origins of the foods that they were selling. Comparisons, often amusing or exaggerated, were sometimes used to drive the point home to buyers. Tomatoes, for example, could be the size of pomegranates or as red as roses. Because Egyptians preferred small cucumbers, they were often likened to kidney beans. Some declared that their dates were as good as lamb. Pistachio sellers compared their products to grilled quail, and sellers of barbecued corn announced that their corn was as tasty as roasted chicken. If the tenderness of the food was important, then the sellers loudly chanted, "Even the toothless can eat them." Upon seeing a child playing in the streets, candy vendors would yell out, "Ayat lommak ya wad," or in very colloquial Egyptian, this means, "Cry to your mother, little boy," urging young children to beg their mothers for candy. There were dozens of non-vocal auditory cues used by street vendors selling candy and other sweets to children. Writing about his childhood during the late 1910s in Cairo's Sayyida Zainab district, Fathi Radwan vividly remembers many of these distinct calls and sounds from vendors. He recalls how the sellers of traditional caramel had the long pieces of the toffee-like candy attached to a long pole with a rattle at the end of it. According to Radwan, when the vendor shook the pole, and I quote, "It produced a loud, irresistible rattling sound that drove all the neighborhood children crazy as they came out of the woodwork with their pennies in hand." Radwan also recalls a vendor selling vanilla wafers who employed a variety of sonic tools to advertise his arrival. And I'm quoting, "He not only blew on a small horn, but made a loud crackling sound by beating two pieces of wood against each other. And for good measure, he sometimes shouted, 'Biscotte vanilla,' or vanilla cookies, for all to hear." So this is an example of that nougat type seller. Of course, this image is from the Egyptian countryside. But it's somewhat similar as far as how the candy was wrapped all the way around the pole. On the top, you see that rattle that would make noise. Butane tank merchants, who are still heard throughout Egypt, could signal their arrival to an entire neighborhood without uttering a single word. Striking their metal butane cylinder with a wrench, they produced a familiar, loud, and rhythmic clanking that sonically carried for several city blocks and signaled the arrival of their truck or horse-drawn cart. Lemonade, sherbet, and licorice juice sellers rhythmically clanked their large castanet-like brass saucers to advertise their cold drinks. During the summer, cold drink sellers and their clanking sounds remained prevalent in the traditional districts of Cairo, well into the mid-20th century. Perhaps the earliest sounded film recording of one of these drink sellers was captured in the winter of 1928 in the raw footage of a newsreel by the Fox Movietone Company. A licorice juice seller, surrounded by a mass of people in Cairo's Al Hussein district, performed in front of the camera while clanking his brass saucers for those who were close by for about 20 seconds or so. And as a matter of fact, here it is. Those of you that have earphones, it's a lot easier to listen to this because the volume is kind of low. So you can go ahead and put them on now. After that clip, I'll continue to play it for about a minute or so, and you can listen to some of the street sounds in Cairo in the late 1920s. See how he loves the camera. Hear the creaking of the wheels of the donkey cart. So, in part because of the transitory nature of the street hawkers, their relationship with the Egyptian state was and still is adversarial and rife with tension. Unsuccessful attempts at regulating, documenting, and taxing them began in the mid-19th century and continue to this day. These regulations attempted not only to dictate where and when these merchants could sell their wares, but also they attempt to control their hygiene, the volume of their calls, and also they try to designate exactly the time of day that they can loudly advertise their merchandise. For example, on paper at least, street hawkers were not allowed to make their calls after sunset, and during the summer, they were forbidden to sell their goods during siesta time, roughly between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. It's important to note that the vast majority of street hawkers were unregulated. And though these laws were on the books, they were at best unevenly enforced. Just like today, police abuse of these street merchants was common. As dozens of petitions to the Egyptian government in the 1930s and 40s attest, police beatings, arrests, and embezzling money from unlicensed merchants was common. When placed under arrest, the most common offense was obstructing traffic. In an October 16, 1944 petition to King Farouk, Abdul Maqsood Khalaf Hassan, the self-proclaimed president of the Public Union of Knick-Knack Peddlers, declares, and I quote, actually, let me show you the petition now. The police are constantly harassing and chasing after us in the streets and alleyways as if we are criminals running from justice. The truth is that we're merely trying to make an honest living. We are without any rights. We endure daily toil and suffer backbreaking work just to barely make ends meet. The doors to other professions are closed shut for us. This is the only means for our livelihood, and it is honest work. We work in the coldest of winter nights and the hottest of summer days. We sell sunglasses, pens, and knickknacks, which are very small and light. We certainly do not cause any traffic obstructions, as is often claimed by the police. After making his case, Hassan then proceeds to lay out three basic demands from the government. Stop chasing after and arresting street hawkers, reform the current laws, facilitate the attainment of street hawker licenses. Not surprisingly, none of these demands were met, as 3 years later, yet another petition was filed complaining of the exact same police abuses. This new petition, dated March 27, 1947, asked the government to recognize and license more street hawkers in order to legitimate their economic activity. These two petitions and many others like them suggest that the laws concerning street hawkers were only partly enforced. So even though, according to state regulations, street merchants were supposed to have licenses, few of these licenses were given out, as they were very difficult to obtain. These uneven and often unsuccessful efforts by the Egyptian police to silence and restrict the activities of street merchants continue till this day. Street hawkers, of course, still thrive in the Egyptian streets, and their voices continue to be loudly heard. I want to begin my conclusion by reading you yet another quote, but a quote from Michel de Certeau, and from his Practice of Everyday Life. The ordinary practitioners of the city live down below the threshold at which visibility begins. They walk, an elementary form of experiencing the city. They are walkers whose bodies follow the thicks and thins of an urban text, which they write without being able to read it. These practitioners make use of spaces that cannot be seen. Their knowledge of them is as blind as that of lovers in each other's arms. De Certeau's depiction of life down below in the street level captures an embodied, extra-visual sensory knowledge that ordinary urban dwellers have of their immediate environment. To a city resident, there is an innate sensory familiarity to a neighborhood street, supplementing known sights with equally familiar, pleasant or unpleasant sounds, smells, and tastes. Even the touch and feel of specific dips, curves, and cracks in the streets and sidewalks become intimately and blindly familiar to pedestrians as they daily walk the same route to work, school, or the market. De Certeau's insistence on the importance of walking the city is, in effect, urging a multi-sensory understanding of space. By literally or figuratively walking in the streets, one can move beyond the watchful gaze of the state, or beyond the two-dimensional plans and maps that were drawn out and put into place by state bureaucrats. As I demonstrated in this presentation, by moving closer and listening in to street life, we can partly reveal how people live their everyday lives, and more importantly, clarify how they dealt with state authorities in their mundane struggles over the use and ownership of the streets. Compared to other approaches, a sensory approach is also more embodied and intimate, as it sheds more light on how ordinary people adapted to the plethora of modernizing changes taking place during the first half of the 20th century. The Egyptian streets were not only a living, breathing laboratory for a rapidly unfolding infrastructural and technological changes, but also it was one of the few places where most elements of society could, potentially at least, interact face to face. I focus on Egyptians who made a living in the streets, from pedestrians and tram riders to merchants and street hawkers, all of whom, of course, left their sonic imprints in the archives. Walking through and using and misusing the city streets is in itself an act of appropriation, as pedestrians sensorially projected their presence. People take ownership of the streets when they use them, whether they are simply walking through sitting in an outdoor cafe, or selling their goods in the city squares and roads. As we examine these embodied possessions of public spaces, of course, they were not always uncontested. The police and the political authorities always attempted to limit, control, and regulate the use of public roads. However, the panoptic powers of the modern states were never as neat, efficient, and controlling as they are sometimes portrayed. Everyday people daily used and misused the streets for their own purposes, to loudly sell, buy, mourn, and celebrate, often breaking a host of state regulations in the process. Police enforcement, if it took place, was loud, messy, and contentious. If the enforcement was successful, it was almost always resisted, negotiated, and at best partially or incompletely imposed. Street hawkers in particular, as we've seen, they frequently petitioned the state to address their grievances, while countless other men and women adapted to all the rapid structural and technological changes by appropriating the very streets and technologies as their own. Ordinary pedestrians, beggars, commuters, paying and non-paying tram passengers, street vendors, and even pickpockets used and misused electric trams, buses, streets, and sidewalks for their own purposes, which effectively allowed them to lay claim to the streets and adapt the very infrastructure of modernity for their own use. There are many more historical dimensions to be discovered if we are open to considering sound as a serious path of inquiry for understanding the past. Sound historian Jonathan Stern accurately declared that, and I quote, "There's always more than one map for a territory, and sound provides a particular path through history. By finding and interpreting new auditory data, historians can add new sensory dimensions to their historical analysis, transforming how we understand the past. As the growing field of sound studies has shown, comprehending the daily experiences of ordinary people requires us to listen more to the past." Thank you.
Thank you so much for this lovely talk. This was fascinating, and congratulations to the book. I see already lots of questions, and people congratulate you as well, and thank you. And thank you especially also for playing this wonderful clip that we could all be for a moment in the 1920s. This was fantastic. Thank you so much, and I think we join with the audience in celebrating you and the book.
Thank you, Adam.
Now, what I would like to do at this moment, first of all, I see our director here, Ellen McLarney. Hi, Ellen.
Hello, Ellen.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for making it.
Thank you. Thank you for an amazing presentation.
Thank you, Ellen. And now what will happen is that I have lots of questions myself, but I would just pose two, let's say, and then we turn to the audience and the audience questions. And I don't know, Ellen, if you have questions, you please jump in. This would be the order of the day, if it's okay with everyone. I am really fascinated by the book and fascinated by the project itself. I have, as I said, tons of questions, but perhaps one might be of interest to everyone, a larger one, and that is that in the recent turn of I don't know how should we call it, material culture or technological turn in the material turn in Middle East history specifically. There are two schools, or one school perhaps with many interpretations, and one would say that the introduction of new technologies such as gas, electricity, oil, and all kinds of energy resources and infrastructure actually boosted up the power of the state, boosted up the power of the governments everywhere. The other interpretation would say that actually the introduction of these new technologies and spaces and energies did the opposite. Actually gave some space to ordinary people who use these new technologies and new sounds and new ways of life as a type of resistance. Where would you position yourself?
Very good question, Adam. Well, if it's just based on this talk, I guess it would be more about the sort of people adapting and using those technologies. But I think it's really both. I think it's almost like a cat and mouse game. You can, I guess, see that if we're jumping way ahead with what happened in 2011, at least early on, that people were using those technologies to their advantages. And as you look at what is happening today, the states are adapting quite quickly and doing a variety of different, using a variety of different techniques in order to co-opt some of the uses of those, at least communication technology. But I don't think you can say one thing or another. I think often whenever one side uses one technology to their advantage, often the other side adapts and finds other ways to co-opting and using the technology for their own purposes. I guess another good example, moving back again to 2011, is when the state immediately shut off the internet, at least in Egypt. People immediately use other forms of maybe slightly older technologies or use satellite and so forth. There's always ways to sort of adapt. I don't think it's one way or another. I think both sides could take advantage of whatever is produced technologically or otherwise. So.
Yeah, thank you. There is also, you have this fascinating archival interest as well. So the sounds that you propose are based on somehow material evidence, empirical evidence from the past. So how a historian works with sound in an archival environment? What does it mean to look for sounds in written sources?
Yeah. Excellent question. And that's something that especially historians are usually very skeptical, especially when they hear about some of these new studies employing sound. But in reality, I think, again, I alluded to this a little bit in this talk, but I'll elaborate a little bit further. I think every single textual source that you can find, or even if you're examining some of your older emails and with friends and relatives and so forth, will have a lot of sensory information. I mean, just, we take that for granted. We assume that everything is going to be visual because it's a written source. But often anything that is written down will convey plenty of sensory inputs. I mean, people will talk about what they ate, what they heard last night, the neighbor was loud, and so on. And I think it really is sort of a ubiquitous source that you can find. And when you're reading any archival source, if you go back and reread it, or newspaper accounts and so forth, you're always going to find all these sensory data that's available. And the trick is to sort of, be sensitive to it ahead of time. So I kid you not, like I even, I wasn't, even though in my first book, I dealt with vernacular sources and often the oral and so forth, I wasn't necessarily attuned to this until I started doing research for this book. And if I go back and reread some of the same sources that I've read, I find a lot of information that people detail. And I think the trick is to not assume that when any writer is conveying a sensory account, that account is less than the visual accounts that they're portraying. To me, I think it's the same thing. For all of our senses, there is still this process of translation that goes on as we we touch something or see something or hear something. It has to be conveyed in our brain, and then eventually, if we're writing something on it, then we're going to retranslate it on paper. And so, to me, it's very similar, and so we can't just assume that the visual is more accurate or somehow has a closer path to what was being depicted. It's still an interpretation that the author has made of whatever sensory input they had in their everyday life. And once you get over that part, and once I got over that part, I could find these sensory sources everywhere, literally. And then, you know, and then the job is a lot easier. But I'm not saying it's easy, but I think, but it's very doable. So.
Well, thank you very much. I know I promised only 2 questions, but before I give the floor to the audience, just one more small one, is that what is the difference between a city soundscape or city soundscapes and countryside soundscapes? So is the countryside the space of silence or quiet as opposed to the city?
No, absolutely not. It's qualitatively different, and it depends on obviously which time period we're examining. But if we're looking at the Egyptian countryside, most even if we're going back to the 1940s or 30s and so forth, most of the Egyptian villages, just by the nature of the geography of Egypt, were located fairly close to railroad tracks, for example. So I would say even the villagers were always accustomed and attuned to the sounds of the railroad coming in. And eventually, of course, as, let's say radio sets became more prevalent, even battery powered ones and so forth. They're just different sounds. And I think, perhaps if you are in a more isolated area, then you can listen more to the sounds of nature. Whereas in the city, there are still sounds of nature in the city. So, if you were attuned to them, but often a lot of these sounds get crowded over by some of these other noises. And again, it really depends on which time period that you're examining. But no, it's not. There's no such thing as just silence in the countryside. There was always a variety of different noises, and that's also available in the sources. Like you can find this. I mean, one of the important keynote sounds for many Egyptian villages throughout is the sound of the water wheel. And if there aren't any microphones or louder noises to overcrowd that, that used to be one of the key distinguishing sounds, especially of these large water wheels. But also the sounds of creaking frogs and so on. And then you add to it locomotives and trains as the technology changes. But they're all sort of, in a sense together. So, but obviously, typically the city tends to be louder. So, not always. Yeah, I mean, in weddings and funerals, and today in the countryside, because of the use of ubiquitous use of loudspeakers everywhere, they're quite loud in Egypt today. So.
Thank you so much. Let me start with the questions. Unless Ellen, I don't know if you want to jump in, or should I start with the questions?
I guess my one question is a little bit along the lines of yours, is about secular versus religious time, and that's kind of an obvious question, because I'm actually teaching a class on Islamic media right now, and we watched a documentary that was made by a Duke graduate student called Cairo in One Breath, and they talk at the end a little bit about the muazzin like unification, that it was gonna be all the then from loudspeaker from previously recorded microphones that then would broadcast. And so I was just wondering what the sort of like secular versus religious soundscapes.
Yeah, they're intermingled, really. And so, like, at least in doing my research, I never tried to sort of separate them and lay them out in that way. But it comes across more in, I can't remember even the number of the chapter. I believe in my chapter 5 in the book, I talk about the sounds of weddings and funerals. And for both, there is sort of a some religious sounds, but often it's intermingled with secular sounds as well, really depending. But I never necessarily sort of separated them because often, especially within Egyptian society, they're often almost always happening, around the same time. Yeah, I mean, I guess depending on the circumstance. So if like today we can listen to some of the sounds of Quranic recitations, people playing the radio, but the car next door will be playing Kulthum, another one will be playing Western music, and it's all sort of intermingled within the Korean streets. But I find that was always the case, going back to even the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, where my focus here on the book. And also, when I talk a little bit about the mawalid in Egypt, that's a perfect example of both, the religious and the secular together. People assume it's a mulid, therefore it's always going to be religious sounds. Of course, that's not the case, and that's a perfect example of this. And especially within that space, I can't, even though it's a mulid, I can't really define it as religious entirely, and so you have everything going on at the same time. And it's kind of hard for me to come in and sort of parse it and theorize about it in a different way. So
very, very interesting. This is just a last comment, and this actually leads into a lot of the questions that are some of the questions that are in the chat that are so interesting. There's such good research recently about sound and kind of conceptions of race, like here in the United States. I mean, I'm not sure if have you heard about these, like the sonic color line and Imagine the Sound? Yeah.
Yes, the author of the sonic color line is a good friend of mine. She's right down the street in Binghamton.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh, she's amazing.
I know.
Yeah, and the book is great too. But that leads into some of the questions. Adam, do you want to go ahead and read them? About kind of, and I really liked at the end of the talk how you're really talking about sort of the subaltern, sound as the subaltern, but then you said, you kind of switched to say, well, it's a dialectical type of, there's sound on high and there's sound like, from right down below.
That's right.
Okay, I go to the questions.
Okay, great.
So Yaron Shemer asks, can you please talk about the street hawkers promoting film showings in nearby movie theaters? I know it was quite a phenomenon in Baghdad up to the 1950s. Was this same thing in Cairo?
It might have been. I didn't run into any specific sources talking about this. I know that some would have flyers to, concerning some of the films that were showing. But I didn't really come across any specific reference where the street hawkers were actually advertising. I don't see why it wouldn't happen. I think it's certainly a possibility, or at least, especially newspaper boys in particular. Often part of their job was sort of announcing what was the latest thing in the newspaper. But I don't recall any specific source to sort of say that this is what took place. So.
Great. Al-Addin Mahmoud asks, was the changing soundscape in Egyptian streets also determined by socio-cultural parameters such as British colonialism, nationalism, and the varying positions of the various ethnic and linguistic communities such as the Greeks, Armenians, and Jews?
Very good question.
Ethnic soundscape.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But yet again, they were intermingled. And so for some of these street hawkers, for example, probably the most iconic street hawker today in Egypt are the Roba Bikia sellers. And often they say either Roba Bikia or just Bikia. And that's originally, as I'm sure Adam knows, is an Italian word for old clothing or old things. So Roba Vikia. And so I would assume that many of the early textile workers in Egypt in the 19th century and early 20th century were Italian, and so the term was a part of it, and it became one of the things that they were yelling out. The same thing with for example, you know about this, Adam, because you wrote about Egyptian bands, and so often a lot of the early military and police bands were playing Western music in the 19th century, but eventually many of those bands started using some of these Western instruments to play Egyptian music, and there was sort of a fusion between some of that old military music with the modern Egyptian music at the time. On and on and on. I mean, you can't really separate a lot of this. There was definitely intermingling of influences. as far as what was heard in the streets based on the population that was living there at the time. And as most of you know, Alexandria was roughly about 25% non-Egyptian, with a variety of different people who some of them might be mutamassirin to some extent, but these influences were always there, affecting language, music, and a variety of different sounds, including some of the street hawker sounds.
Thank you, Ziad. Thank you very much. The next question is from Khaled Issa. I wanted to ask two simple questions. The first is beyond the archive. In what ways did people manage to record or remember these sounds? I'm not just thinking about videos, but possible examples of how artists like Said Darwish was able to engage in this process. The second question is where did you find the political cartoons from 1928 and the petitions?
Yeah, the petitions in Egyptian archives, but there are others that you can find in the British archives as well. For the cartoons and newspapers, that's easy nowadays. More and more of those newspapers, as Adam knows more than anyone, because he's been helping with the digitization efforts or knows more about the digitization efforts of a lot of these older newspapers, and more of them can be found online. But you can certainly get them through interlibrary loans, or if you go to Egypt and Dar Kutub, it's kind of a pain to use Dar Kutub nowadays. The other question, yes. So an important component, I think, in my book, but in general about sounds of the past, is nostalgia and memory. And there were two parts of your question, really. You talked about the Said Darwish line and some of his music, and he certainly, for a lot of his musical production, he is sort of conveying some of the sounds that he heard in the street and interpreting them in his own artistic way. And that continued on, and a lot of his music stayed very, very popular in Egypt till this day. And often they have this nostalgic element where there is a remembrance of some of these sounds in the streets, including many of those street hawkers in many of his songs. Especially there's a song that he has on water cellars, for example, but many others. But often, whenever you have nostalgia, people often remember not just with their visual sense, but especially with their other senses. You often remember certain smells and sounds from your childhood and in the past. And for many of my sources that are outside the archives were the Radwan memoir, for example, that I briefly alluded to. And it's about his childhood. And if you read it, 90% of the references are about remembering some of the smells and the sounds of the past. And so that's usually the case when you're remembering something. Usually it's definitely multisensory, and it sort of resonates with you. It's the food that your grandmother used to cook and how they tasted and how they smelled. It's the sounds that you heard in the streets, as far as some of those street merchants that I mentioned selling candy and so forth. For me, I suppose it was some of the street sounds, because I grew up in Alexandria, but then I moved to central New Jersey when I was 11 years old. And so some of the two keynote sounds from both places, and in Egypt, certainly the Robabikia, but also there was a fava bean cellar, food cellar in Alexandria. And sort of I still remember it fondly. And then moving to the States, it was the Good Humor ice cream man. And that was the one thing that sort of that I'd remember, his bell, and then the Italian ice van as well with its music. And so it sort of resonates and stays with you.
Thank you, Professor Fahmy. Noah Forster has a question. I mean, there are many questions, and I will pose them one after the other. So Noah Forster has two questions actually. Will you be able to gather the actual poetry of the wandering fruit sellers? Second question, does your book treat the effects of the introduction of compact radios and its effects on public space, such as the spread of the Quran songs and advice shows?
Yeah, for the first question, there are plenty of sources on precisely what was being chanted as far as many of the street sellers. It's not comprehensive, but it gives you sort of a snippet of some of these chants that they were making. and a variety of sources document this. They weren't all exactly the same. They were different. I mean, you can have, if you're listening to 2 or 3 different Rubabikya sellers, the intonation is going to be different. The sound is going to be different. Sometimes the chant is completely different. But you can definitely find some of this in the sources. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, but in this book, I sort of stopped around circa 1950. So it was before sort of the transistor revolution in the 60s and 70s, when many of the smaller, cheaper radios were prevalent and could be heard everywhere in the streets. You could still hear lots of radios, but mainly they were mostly stationary radios in coffee shops or other shops, mechanic shops, and so forth. And certainly there's plenty of evidence that they were loudly heard in the streets and beyond, because there were many laws trying to regulate them throughout, and it's throughout the press from the 1930s all the way through. They were definitely prevalent in the urban areas.
Thank you. The next question is from Miriam Sutter. How far was music present in the past? How did the music change in the passing of time? I presume Arabic music? Or
yeah.
Whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll roughly try to answer that. Well, music was always there in Egypt, in the streets, regardless. And that was always the case. Weddings, even funerals, more so in the past than today. But there was always a street presence of it, street performers, and there were definitely changes, as we alluded to with some of many of the foreigners that were living in Egypt at the time. There was different introductions of different styles of music, and also different instruments that were being introduced as well, that changed the sound somewhat. With new technologies, of course, it allowed for more, whereas before you would have street musicians in your neighborhood, let's say in the 1820s or 30s, and the music wasn't as standardized as it would become when you have, phonograph records being introduced, and then radio, where more and more people across the urban areas, but also in the rural areas, would hear to sort of the similar sounds. So by the 1940s and 50s, everybody heard Kulthum, whereas if you move back to the early phases of Munir al-Mahdiya, for example, only those that could listen to some of the phonograph records. Prior stars, even less so. So that changes the dynamic of who was exposed to what sort of music, obviously. So technology plays a big role in this.
Yeah, Munira Magdiya is very popular these days. Okay, she has a comeback.
Hey, never too late.
Let me read aloud the question of Professor Carmen Guitre. Hi, Carmen.
Carmen, how are you?
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if you come across commentary on gendered voices. Were women's voices, for example, considered and accepted as part of the soundscape across the city, or were certain spaces considered appropriate or inappropriate for their voice? Very good question.
Yeah, I think if I would try to answer the question, I think it's probably class-based, and it really depends on where and which parts of Cairo we're talking about. Because I think in most of Cairo, women's voices were a part of the street, public, part of the public voices in the streets, in the market, as you saw with many of the street merchants. They obviously were not silent. But I think you'd have to almost triangulate temporally and by class and which parts, let's say, of the city. So I think in the popular areas, and for most Egyptians, I think women's voices were loudly heard in the streets and in the markets and so forth. I mean, before water became prevalent in pipes and so forth, it wasn't just the male water sellers that were selling their water. Predominantly in poorer neighborhoods, it was the women who were going out and bringing water in the streets. They were the ones that were going and shopping in the markets and selling some of their goods as well. So I think if you break it down, I guess temporally, but also by class, you would see that. Another way to try to answer this question is when we're looking at the sound, back to the sounds of weddings and funerals again. And often for both, predominantly it was women's voices that were heard. It was actually the opposite, where men were not supposed to be loud in their mourning. And women, it was sort of expected within that sphere of mourning or celebration to hear women's voices as opposed to the male voices, which is kind of odd. But good question. Gets you thinking a little bit more into the sources themselves. So, but again, it depends on time and place and occasion. Apparently, if you're looking at both weddings and funerals. Yeah, I could go on forever. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And Carmen also says hi. The next question is from Ifdal. If the family name is not displayed, so Ifdal E. Did you come across lamentations for a lost soundscape? I'm thinking in particular about the sounds of the natural sound landscape, birds, the wind, etc. Excellent question.
I didn't focus on natural sounds, but as far as lamentations, he means lamentations for loss? Yeah, that was for in mourning sounds. They used to be a lot more elaborate in the past than they are today, but especially in Upper Egypt, but also elsewhere in Egypt. There were sort of elaborate lamentations that were done especially by female mourners. And in the book, I discussed sort of a variety of different types. Some are much more poetic, and others are more about sort of the crying out of the grief itself. And so there's sort of an elaborate history of that in Egypt. But many of this is, I would say, dying out, and for a variety of different reasons. It's still there, but the specifics for the lamentations themselves are no longer as prevalent as they used to be in the past. So, and I talk about why in the book, but it's much more of an elaborate argument. So.
Thank you very much. Well, just one last question jumped in. I don't know actually how long we can go, Griffin or Ellen, but if you still have a few minutes, Professor Fahmy, there is one more question.
Go on.
So Ibrahim Gamea, I presume, how about sounds that came from speakers of state institutions, like schools and mosques? How that influenced the Egyptian soundscape? How did Egyptians see that type of sound? Have you come across any complaints from Egyptians about that type of sound, maybe, like we see today?
State sounds?
State sounds, complaints about state sounds.
Yeah. Yeah, it's another one of those things where I have a whole chapter on it. I was actually debating as I was writing whether to include it or not, because that's the only chapter that talks about not everyday sounds coming from the streets, more of the sort of state sounds. Yeah, you wouldn't find the complaints, at least in the archives. But obviously, there were a lot of elaborate state sounds throughout the 19th and the 20th century, from firing of cannons and so forth, whenever, for special occasions with the king coming in, funerals for members of the royal family. You would have sort of elaborate marches within the streets with military bands and gunfire and so on. Also, as radio became more prevalent, even before Egypt, like the official Egyptian radio station was started in 1934, the Egyptian royal family, going back to, King Fuad, they began to broadcast some of the official speeches and occasions on the airwaves. Not only that, but for good measure, they would place loudspeakers in some of the key meydans throughout Egypt. Yeah, I didn't find any recorded complaints by people over many of those sounds. But some of these state sounds were also produced in the countryside as well in certain occasions. So anniversaries and so forth, where members of the royal family would go with their entourages, and they would set up these loudspeakers in these villages in some of those visitations, whether it was the birthday of the king or some other occasions, weddings and so forth. And most of the notables in those villages would probably have to appear and so forth, and they have the loudspeakers playing the music, and sometimes, depending on the occasion, the speech by the king and so forth. So yeah, and of course the official music by the state, and they would have some of that music playing as well.
Okay, thank you so much for these wonderful answers, and thank you, the audience, for these wonderful questions. Perhaps before we close, you would share some thoughts about what is your next work about the Egyptian radio.
All right, I'll briefly talk about that. The next book project will be on Egyptian radio, and I already started writing it. I don't know when it'll be done because it's going to be an extensive project, but it'll take on Egyptian radio it'll start from the before 1934 period when Egyptian radio was monopolized by the government, and will continue on. I'll probably stop in the 1950s. Yeah, there hasn't been much written on Egyptian radio, surprisingly, and it was definitely a very, very important and effective tool for a variety of different reasons. And I haven't 100% decided how I'm going to organize it, but I think probably the first half of the book will look more on the technological infrastructure as it was set up, and trying to figure out what the audience was and the importance of these sounds, and how potentially it affected maybe going back to nationalism again, sort of a continuation of the first book. The second half will actually delve into some of the programming itself, and it wasn't just. I'm not going to just talk about music. I mean, music will play a small part. I'll look into some of the children's shows. Quranic recitation perhaps would take one chapter, and looking at the variety of different programming that was targeting different parts of the Egyptian population. So,
is there going to be a chapter on Nassar's speeches?
I'm going to stop before.
Right.
If I'm going to write my fourth book, it'll be just Nassar, because it's just a whole other ball game when you get to Nassar, because then it really has to be more of a transnational book and looking at Sot al-Arab and beyond. But I think I'll stop by 52 for this one. So
the radio wars between Iraq and Egypt are super fascinating.
That's the fun stuff. Yeah. Or Egypt and Jordan, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
Great. So thank you so much, Professor Fahmy. I don't know, Ellen or Griffin, you have anything to say? I think we are just super grateful to you.
We're super grateful to you all.
And
I mean, the semester is over, so this is our culminating event, honestly. Yeah.
The end of the Zoom road. So we can
I
take a breather.
I have been on Zoom now for 3 hours straight. No, 3 hours and 15 minutes. So
it's too much. Yeah, it is too much. So thank you,
this
Robin.
This is amazing. Thank you.
Yep, and thank you for hosting this. So Adam, Ellen, and Griffin, we appreciate it. So hopefully I'll see you guys in person in some future Mesa.
Yeah, and
post-pandemic.
And thank you to the audience. Thank you so much for being with us and for your excellent questions. And hope to see everyone